The snow was still falling on Christmas Eve when my daughter walked into Golden Oak Senior Living, carrying a poinsettia she had clearly bought at the gas station on her way over, and she set it down on my nightstand like she was placing a wreath on a grave. She did not hug me. She did not take off her coat. She stood there in her cream-colored cashmere and her diamond studs, looked around my room at the narrow bed and the little television bolted to the wall, and she smiled the smile she used to give waiters when the soup was cold. "Well," Denise said, "look at you, still here." I was 71 years old, and I had not seen my daughter's face in 11 months. And the first thing out of her mouth was not my name. It was an inventory. Still here, like I was a piece of furniture she had forgotten to sell at the estate auction. "Merry Christmas to you too," I said, and I meant it to come out gentle, but 4 years of practicing gentleness in a room that smelled like antiseptic and canned gravy will do something to a woman's voice. It came out thin. She walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot, at the other families unloading gift bags and folding wheelchairs out of trunks, at the whole cheerful machinery of a holiday being performed in a place built for endings. "Marcus couldn't make it," she said, not looking at me. "Business." I did not ask what business. I had learned, over 4 Christmases in this building, that the fastest way to lose an entire visit was to ask my son a direct question. Marcus answered direct questions with silence, and indirect ones with excuses, and either way, I ended up alone by 4 in the afternoon, staring at a Hallmark movie with the volume too low because Rosalind next door was trying to nap. "I brought you a candle," Denise said, and set a candle down next to the poinsettia. Vanilla bean. $6, maybe $7. "The room smells like old people." I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment, because I certainly had to. The room smells like old people. Said to the old person. In the room. On Christmas. I did not say anything. I had gotten very good in 4 years at not saying anything. It is a skill nobody teaches you and everybody expects you to master the moment you turn 70 and become, in the eyes of your own children, slightly less than a full person. "Is anyone coming for you today?" I asked her, because I still, God help me, wanted to know if my daughter had somewhere warmer to be than my room. Wanted to know if she had a family gathered around a table somewhere waiting on her. Wanted, in some small, stupid corner of my heart, for her to say she'd come because she missed me. Denise laughed. Not a warm laugh, the kind of laugh you give a joke that isn't funny. The kind that exists mostly to let the other person know you've already moved past them. "Coming for me? Mom, it's Christmas. Everyone's coming for me." She pulled out her phone, glanced at it, thumbed something quickly, and looked back up. "What about you? Anybody visiting? Or is it just—" She gestured vaguely at the room, at the walls, at the plastic pine wreath the staff had hung on my door. "This." I looked down at my hands. I have old hands now. Spotted, thin-skinned, the wedding ring loose enough that I keep a rubber band under it so it doesn't slide off in the shower. Frank used to hold these hands like they were something precious. It had been 6 years since he died, and 4 years since Denise and Marcus had decided, over a dinner I was not invited to, that I could no longer be trusted to live in my own house. "Rosalind next door has her granddaughter coming," I said, "and Tommy said he'd try to stop by before his shift." Tommy is my grandson, Denise's son, 26 years old, works nights at a distribution warehouse because the job market did not care that he'd graduated with honors, and he is the only person who calls me every single Sunday without fail, rain or shine, whether I have anything interesting to say or not. Denise's face did something complicated when I said his name. A flicker, gone fast. I have learned to read my daughter's face the way sailors read weather, because she never says the true thing out loud. She only lets it pass across her features like a cloud shadow crossing a field. "Tommy's busy," she said. "He shouldn't be wasting his time driving out here on his one day off." "It's not a waste," I said quietly. "He's my grandson." "It's a waste of gas and a waste of a day when you could be spending it with people your own age," Denise said, gesturing again at the hallway, where I could hear the low murmur of a television turned up too loud in the common room, where Harold from 114 was arguing with an aide about whether it was Tuesday. "This is your life now, Mom. This is where you live. You should make peace with it instead of dragging Tommy into your—" She paused, searching for the word, and landed on one that I felt in my chest like a struck bell. Situation. My situation. As if I had wandered in here on my own. As if I had not been told 4 Christmases ago that the house needed temporary repairs and that I would just stay a little while at a lovely place Denise had found, and then watched my daughter and son quietly, efficiently, and without a single follow-up phone call, dismantle every corner of my old life while I sat in a rented room waiting for the repairs to finish. Before I go further, if you have ever sat in a room like that one, waiting on people who were never coming back for you, I want you to know I see you, and I want you to stay with me, because this story does not end where you think it ends. Denise checked her phone again. Whatever was on that screen mattered more to her than the woman standing 3 feet away from her who had raised her, fed her, sat up nights with her fevers, and driven 6 hours through an ice storm once just to bring her chicken soup during her first semester of college. I watched my daughter's thumb move across the glass, and I thought, not for the first time, that I had spent 40 years teaching this girl how to love, and somewhere along the way she had learned instead how to leave. "I have to go," Denise said, sliding the phone into her purse. "We're doing the big family dinner at the house tonight. The real one." She said real like it was a knife she was testing for sharpness. "You know, since it's ours now." Ours. The house Frank and I built our whole marriage inside of. The house where I had planted the rose bushes along the side fence with my own 2 hands the spring after Tommy was born. The house that Denise and Marcus had told me 4 years ago needed to be sold for my own protection, so that my care here could be paid for, so that I wouldn't have to worry about upkeep alone. I had asked back then, careful and small, whether I would ever get to go home again. Denise had laughed that same laugh back then too and said, "Mom, come on, look at you. You're going to be alone in that big house forever if we don't do something. Is that really what you want? To just sit there and rot, still alone?" Still alone. She had said it then. She was saying it again now, 4 years later, in a different sentence but with the exact same cruelty pressed into it like a signature. "I should get going before traffic," Denise said, already at the door, already gone in every way that mattered even though her body hadn't left the room yet. She paused there, hand on the frame, and looked back at me with an expression I can only describe as amused pity. "Still alone this year too, huh, Mom? Still nobody? Still just you?" She let out a small laugh, shook her head, and said the words that would end up, before that same night was over, meaning something entirely different to her than she intended. "Still alone, LOL. LOL. My 50-year-old daughter, standing in the doorway of the room she'd put me in, said the letters out loud, like a punchline, like this was a text message and not my whole remaining life. And then she left, and the poinsettia sat there dying slowly under the fluorescent light. And I sat on the edge of my narrow bed in a building I had not chosen, in a life I had not agreed to. And for one long, terrible moment, I let myself feel exactly as small as she wanted me to feel. But only for a moment. Because what Denise did not know, what neither of my children had bothered to learn about me in 4 years of drive-by visits and half-sentence explanations, was that I was not, in fact, alone. And I was not, in fact, without resources. And the house she was so proud of, the one she'd called ours in that same greedy little voice, was not actually hers to be proud of at all. To understand how we got to that Christmas, and what I was quietly about to do in return, you have to go back 4 years, to the week my children decided I had become inconvenient. It started, as these things so often do, with a phone call I wasn't meant to overhear. I want to tell you about my husband Frank first, though, because none of what follows makes sense without him. Frank Whitfield was a machinist by trade and a builder by nature, and in 1974 he took a small inheritance from his own father and bought a failing auto parts supply company on the east side of town. And over the next 30 years, he turned it into Whitfield Precision Components, a business that eventually employed 60 people and supplied parts to 3 different states. I was not a silent partner in that marriage. I kept the books for the first 15 years before we could afford real accountants. I sat in on every major decision. I signed every loan, co-signed every lease, and when Frank wanted to expand into aerospace fittings in 1991, against the advice of 2 bankers, it was my hand that pushed his pen across that paperwork, because I believed in him before the banks did. When Frank died 6 years ago, of a heart that had simply worked hard for too long, he left me 2 things that mattered more than either of my children ever understood. He left me the house, paid off, deeded solely in my name because his own mother had lost everything in a divorce and he never wanted that vulnerability for me. And he left me 41% ownership in Whitfield Precision Components, which our son Marcus had been running as CEO for the last decade, believing, quite reasonably, that his father's death would eventually mean his mother's shares would simply pass to him without comment or complication. I want to be honest with you. I loved my son. I love him still, in the complicated way you love a child who has disappointed you in ways you never saw coming. But grief does something strange to a family's math. Within 8 months of Frank's funeral, Marcus stopped asking my opinion on the business entirely. Within a year, he stopped mentioning it at all. And within 2 years, my daughter, Denise, who had never worked a single day inside that company, had somehow become its vice president of family relations, a title that existed nowhere on any organizational chart before her name got attached to it. I noticed things. I noticed the new car in Marcus's driveway. I noticed Denise's kitchen renovation, marble countertops, the kind of marble you don't afford on a non-existent salary. I noticed that the dividend checks that used to arrive like clockwork every March had slowed to a trickle, and then, eventually, to nothing at all, with Marcus explaining, whenever I brought it up, that the company was reinvesting in growth and that I wouldn't understand the complexities. I understood the complexities. I had built half of them myself 20 years before Marcus ever set foot in that building, in a suit that cost more than his father's first delivery truck. It was on a Tuesday in October, 4 years ago, that I picked up the extension in the kitchen to call my sister and heard Denise's voice already on the line, mid-sentence, talking to Marcus. "She's going to figure it out eventually if we keep stalling on the transfer paperwork," Denise was saying. "We need her somewhere she can't just wander into the office and start asking questions about the Meridian contract." I stood very still in my own kitchen, the phone pressed to my ear, my heart doing something strange and cold in my chest. "She's fine where she is," Marcus said, his voice tired in a way that made me want, absurdly, to comfort him even as he was talking about disappearing me. "The house is too big for her alone. Everyone will agree with that. We say it's for her safety. Nobody's going to argue with two adult children trying to protect their elderly mother." Elderly mother. I was 67 years old at the time. I drove myself to the grocery store. I did my own taxes. I still beat both of my children at gin rummy every single Thanksgiving. But in that one sentence, spoken by my own son to my own daughter, I became a category instead of a person. A problem with a solution already selected. "What about the shares?" Denise asked, and I heard something in her voice sharpen, the way it always did when money entered a conversation. 41% is 41%, Marcus. If she starts asking real questions about where the dividends went— "She won't," Marcus said. "Once she's settled somewhere, she'll be too tired to fight it. You know how it goes. They get there, they get comfortable, and eventually they just sign whatever you put in front of them because it's easier than arguing." I set the phone down so gently, so silently, that neither of them ever knew I had heard a single word. And I want you to understand something about that moment, because it is the hinge on which this entire story turns. I did not cry. I did not confront them. I stood in my kitchen, the kitchen where I had made 40 years of birthday cakes and 40 Thanksgiving turkeys and every single bowl of chicken soup either of my children had ever eaten while sick, and I made a decision instead. I decided that if my own children had already decided I was a problem to be solved, I would let them believe, for as long as necessary, that the solving was working exactly as planned. 3 weeks later, Denise sat across from me at this same kitchen table with a folder of brochures for 4 different assisted living facilities, and she used the words "for your own good" 11 times in a single conversation. I know because I counted. Counting things had already become, without my fully realizing it yet, my new way of surviving my family. "It's not permanent, Mom," she'd said, sliding the Golden Oaks brochure toward me, the one with the smiling, silver-haired couple on the cover who did not look one single day like anyone who actually lived there. "Just until we get the house's repairs sorted and figure out a long-term plan. You'll love it. There's bingo, there's a garden." I asked her that day what would happen to the house while I was gone. She told me it would need work, that they'd handle the details, that I shouldn't worry my head about paperwork. I asked what would happen to my shares in the company, since Frank had left them to me directly and not to Marcus. She told me Marcus's lawyer would streamline things while I focused on getting settled. What none of them knew, what I had not told a single soul, not even my own sister, not yet, was that 6 months before Frank died, when his heart had first started giving him trouble and we both understood, quietly, that our time together had an ending we could now see the shape of. He had sat me down at that same kitchen table with our old friend and attorney, Walter Briggs, and the 3 of us had spent one long Sunday afternoon rewriting everything. Walter Briggs had been Frank's attorney for 30 years by then, and my friend nearly as long. A careful, quiet man who had watched our children turn into the adults they became, and who had, over the years, developed his own clear-eyed opinions about which of them could be trusted with what. Frank trusted Walter's judgment the way he trusted very few people outside our marriage. That Sunday, we did 3 things. We placed the house, my house, the one Frank had deeded solely to me, into an irrevocable trust, with our grandson Tommy as the sole named beneficiary and Walter as trustee, effective immediately, not upon my death. The trust reserved exactly one thing for me, and Walter wrote it out in plain language on the 2nd page: the right to live in that house, undisturbed, for the rest of my natural life. Not one board of it could be sold, borrowed against, mortgaged, or signed over by anyone at all. Not by Marcus, not by Denise, and not, on my worst and loneliest day, by me. We restructured my 41% of Whitfield Precision components into voting shares held inside that same trust, meaning that no matter what happened to me, no matter where anyone decided I should live, control of those shares could never simply be signed away by a tired old woman handed a stack of papers in an unfamiliar room. And we wrote a letter. Frank wrote most of it himself, in his own hand, the same hand that used to sign delivery invoices at 4 in the morning before the sun came up over the loading dock. He sealed it, gave it to Walter, and told him it was to be opened only when I decided the time was right, and not one moment before. "They're going to underestimate her," Frank told Walter that day, nodding toward me like I wasn't sitting right there listening to him describe me. "They always have. Their whole lives, they've watched their mother make dinner and keep quiet at parties and let their father take the credit for ideas that were half hers. And they think that's all she is. I want them to find out, someday, exactly how wrong they were. But only when she's ready to let them find out." I remember laughing at him that day, a real laugh, the kind Denise had forgotten I was even capable of. I told him he was being dramatic, that our children would never do anything so calculated as to try to strip me of a house and a business the moment he was gone. Frank had looked at me with such tenderness and such sadness, and said the sentence I have carried with me every single day since. "Eleanor, I've watched Marcus run numbers his whole life. I've watched Denise run people. Neither one of them has ever once, not once, run out of an excuse for why the numbers or the people ended up serving them best. Protect yourself. Not because I think they're evil, because I think they're weak. And weak people do terrible things to the ones who love them most and call it necessary." He was right. 6 months later, he was gone. And 2 years after that, I was standing in a kitchen holding a phone I had just quietly set down, listening to my own children discuss my disappearance the way you'd discuss moving a piece of furniture out of a room that had gotten too crowded. So when Denise handed me that Golden Oaks brochure and told me it was temporary, and told me not to worry about the house, and told me Marcus's lawyer would handle my shares, I looked at my daughter and I nodded, and I said, "All right, if you both think it's best." I let them believe they had won. I let them pack my things into 11 boxes, most of which never even made it to my new room, quietly redistributed instead among storage that I never once saw again. I let them sell my furniture at what they called an estate sale, and I called a fire sale. My grandmother's china going for $4 a plate to strangers who did not know that plate had survived a house fire in 1952. I let them take the keys to my own front door out of my hand in the parking lot of Golden Oaks Senior Living on a gray Tuesday in November 4 years ago. And I did not fight them. Because Walter Briggs had already told me something Denise and Marcus had no idea existed. "Eleanor," Walter had said to me on the phone the night before I moved in, his voice steady and careful the way it always was. "They can put you anywhere they want. They cannot touch a single thing that matters. The house is not theirs. The shares are not theirs. And Frank's letter is still sitting in my safe, waiting for the day you tell me you're ready." He paused, and I heard him turn a page on his end of the line. "And hear me on this next part, Eleanor, because it will matter more than you think it does. Golden Oaks is $5,400 a month. Assisted living, private pay. Medicare does not cover a single dollar of it. And you are not going to be applying for Medicaid because you do not need to. I will be writing that check myself every month out of Frank's life insurance and the accounts that have never had anyone's name on them but yours. Let your daughter tell people she is taking care of her mother. The only thing Denise is actually going to be paying for is the gasoline it takes her to drive out there and say so." I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I certainly have, every single day for 4 years. My children believed they had taken everything from me. In truth, I had already made sure there was nothing real left for them to take. What they had actually done, and this is the part they never once considered, not for a single moment, in all their scheming and their marble countertops and their new cars, was buy themselves 4 years to prove to me, one visit at a time, one missed birthday at a time, one cruel little joke at a time, exactly what kind of children they had truly become. I want to tell you what those 4 years actually looked like from the inside. Because a story like mine can sound, if you only hear the ending, like patience was easy. It was not easy. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. Harder even than burying Frank. Because burying Frank came with grief that everyone around me understood and made room for. And this came with grief that I had to hide every single day from the very people who had caused it. The first birthday I spent at Golden Oaks, my 68th, no one visited at all. Not Denise, not Marcus. A card arrived 4 days late, signed only with Denise's name, in handwriting that looked rushed. The kind of signature you scrawl at a red light before dropping an envelope in a mailbox on your way to somewhere more important. Rosalind baked me a box cake in the little kitchenette down the hall that the staff let residents use for special occasions. And Nadia snuck in a candle from home because the facility didn't allow open flames in the rooms. And the two of them sang to me quietly enough that we wouldn't disturb the residents already asleep by 8. I blew out that candle and made a wish I did not tell either of them, though I suspect Rosalind guessed it anyway. I wished that night for the strength to keep waiting. Tommy called that evening too, the way he always did, and when he asked how my birthday had been, I told him it had been lovely, because I had learned by then that protecting the people who actually loved me sometimes meant not burdening them with the weight of what the others had failed to do. He asked gently whether his mother had called. I told him she'd sent a card. He went quiet on the line for a moment, and then he said something I have never forgotten. "Grandma, I don't understand how anyone could forget you're a person and not just a problem." I did not have an answer for him that night. I only told him I loved him and that his call was worth more to me than every unlit candle his mother and uncle had ever failed to send. The visits, when they came, were their own particular education in cruelty. Denise came twice a year, roughly, and by that last year, barely even that. Always with some object meant to demonstrate generosity that cost almost nothing and required almost no thought. A scented candle. A magazine subscription I never asked for and never read. Once, memorably, a coupon book for a pharmacy 2 towns over that she must have grabbed from her own junk mail on the drive-in, because my name wasn't even on the front of it. Marcus visited even less. Once a year, if that. Usually around some holiday obligation he could not entirely avoid without his wider social circle noticing his absence. He would sit across from me in the common room, checking his watch every few minutes, talking mostly about himself, about the company's exciting new direction, about a phrase he used so often in those years that I came to recognize it as the sound a lie makes when it has been rehearsed enough times to feel almost true in the speaker's own mouth. Restructuring for growth. I heard that phrase from my son at least a dozen times over 4 years. And I want you to understand, I did not yet have the documents Walter would eventually assemble, but I had been keeping the books for that company since before either of my children were born. And a mother who has done payroll with her own 2 hands can smell a lie about company finances the way she can smell rain coming before the first cloud appears. I started noticing things quietly, the way I had trained myself to notice things my entire married life. Back when Frank would come home distracted, and I would know, before he said a single word, whether the distraction was a supplier problem, or a payroll problem, or simply exhaustion. The dividend checks, which had arrived like clockwork every March for the first year after Frank's death, slowed the second year to a single small deposit in the fall, then stopped altogether by the third year. Always with some explanation from Marcus about reinvestment, about a slow quarter, about patience being required from someone he clearly assumed had nothing left to spend her patience on but daytime television and bingo. I began asking, very gently, very carefully, worded questions designed to sound like the confusion of a woman who did not fully understand her own finances. Marcus, dear, whatever happened with this year's dividend? I must have misplaced the statement. He would tell me the statement was coming, that the accountant was behind, that I shouldn't worry my head about it. 3 separate years, 3 separate versions of the same excuse, and each time I nodded and smiled and let him believe the question had satisfied me completely. It did not satisfy me. Not once. But I understood something Frank had tried to teach me decades earlier. Back when we were negotiating a difficult supplier contract, and I wanted, badly, to walk away from the table in anger. He had put his hand over mine and said quietly that the person who shows their hand first is rarely the person who wins. I did not show my hand, not to Marcus, not to Denise, not even, in truth, fully to myself some days, when the loneliness of that narrow room pressed in hard enough that patience felt less like strategy and more like punishment I had somehow agreed to serve. There were nights, more of them than I will ever fully admit to anyone but you, when I lay awake wondering whether I was simply telling myself a comforting story, whether the trust, the letter, the shares, all of it, was less a quiet plan in motion and more an old woman's fantasy, something I clung to so I would not have to face the plainer, sadder truth that my children had simply stopped loving me the way children are supposed to love a mother. And no document in any lawyer's safe was ever going to change that particular fact. I want to be honest with you about those nights, because I think too many stories like mine skip past them in a hurry to get to the satisfying part. And in skipping past them, they let you believe that patience is simple, that righteous waiting never once wavers. Mine wavered plenty. I cried in that room more times over 4 years than I have cried in my entire life put together, and some of those tears had nothing to do with strategy or trusts or hidden shares. Some of them were simply the plain, unglamorous grief of a mother who missed her children, even the versions of them who no longer deserved to be missed. But every single time that grief threatened to convince me to call Marcus and simply confront him outright, to skip ahead, to end the waiting on my own exhausted terms, instead of the terms Frank and Walter and I had so carefully built, something would happen to steady me again. Tommy would call, unprompted, just to tell me about his day. Rosalind would knock on my door with a deck of cards and a look on her face that said, without a single word, that she understood exactly what kind of night I was having and had decided, simply, to sit with me through it. And once, memorably, in the 3rd year, Nadia found me at the break room computer at 2 a.m, unable to sleep, quietly reviewing a scanned financial document Walter had sent over. And instead of asking a single question about what I was doing, she simply set a cup of tea beside my elbow and said, "Whatever it is you're building in here, Miss Eleanor, I hope it's worth every minute it's costing you." I told her it would be. I am not certain, even now, that I fully believed myself in that moment. But I said it anyway, because saying it out loud, to someone who trusted me without demanding proof, was its own kind of medicine. The evidence, in those years, accumulated the way water accumulates behind a dam that nobody watching from the outside believes is under any real pressure at all. A laid-off machinist named Roy Hendricks, 22 years on the floor, who Tommy mentioned in passing during one of our calls, had been let go with barely 2 weeks' notice, despite the company supposedly restructuring for growth. A new car in Marcus's driveway that Denise had once mentioned proudly cost more than double what Marcus's public salary at the company could reasonably explain. Marble countertops in Denise's kitchen that I only ever saw in photographs Tommy occasionally showed me, since I was never once invited to see them in person. Small facts, none of them alone proof of anything. Together, over 4 years, they formed a shape I recognized instantly, because I had spent 30 years learning to recognize exactly that shape in Frank's own ledgers, back when a supplier was quietly skimming from an invoice and neither of us could yet prove it outright. And through every single one of those small, accumulating facts, my children continued, without fail, to treat me as though I had nothing left worth taking seriously. Denise, in particular, developed a habit over those 4 years of speaking to me the way you might speak to a confused child, slowly, a little too loudly, over-explaining simple concepts as though 4 years in a senior facility had somehow dissolved 30 years of running half a household budget and half a business ledger. "Mom, do you understand what I'm saying?" she would ask, after explaining something entirely obvious, and I would nod and say, "Yes, dear, of course," because letting her believe I had grown simple was, by then, simply part of the architecture I was quietly building around all of us. I think, looking back, that this was the cruelest and most useful gift my children ever accidentally gave me. Their absolute certainty that I had become smaller, slower, less capable, meant that neither of them ever once thought to check whether the quiet old woman in room 214 might still be exactly the woman who used to push loan papers across a banker's desk with a steady hand and an unshakable read on the numbers. They underestimated me so completely, so thoroughly, so consistently, that they built, without ever meaning to, the perfect blind spot for everything Walter and I were assembling behind it. By that final autumn, the 4th one, I knew almost everything that mattered before Marcus ever tried to list the house. I knew the consulting payments existed, though I did not yet know the full figure. I knew the layoffs had continued past what any honest restructuring could explain. I knew, in the particular, certain way a mother knows her own child's voice, even through static on a bad phone line, that something large and ugly was coming due, and that when it finally did come due, I intended to be standing exactly where I could watch it happen. What I had not yet decided, walking into that final Christmas visit, was whether I would give Walter the word that day or let one more year go by first. Everything else was already in place. Only the word was missing, and my daughter, entirely by her own careless cruelty, made that decision for me before she had been in the room 10 minutes, and with a laugh she did not even bother to hide. But some part of me, the part that had spent 4 years counting excuses and dividend checks and missed birthdays with the same careful attention I once gave company ledgers, understood that this Christmas felt different from the 3 before it. This Christmas felt like the last one I intended to spend waiting. And on that Christmas Eve, 4 years later, standing in my narrow room after Denise walked out laughing at her own joke, I finally understood something with total clarity. I was done watching. I was done waiting to see if they would change. I picked up the phone on my nightstand and I dialed Walter Briggs, not for one of our careful quarterly check-ins, not to ask whether the trust was still intact and hear him tell me patiently that it was, but to finally say out loud the sentence I had been holding in my mouth for 4 years. "Walter," I said, when he answered on the second ring, his voice as familiar and warm as it had been the day Frank introduced us 30 years earlier. "It's Eleanor. I think it's time." There was a pause on the line, and then Walter Briggs, 78 years old and still sharp as the day he passed the bar exam, said the words I had been waiting 4 long years to hear spoken back to me. "It's about time, Eleanor. Tell me what you need." What none of them knew, not Denise, laughing her way out of my room with vanilla candles and cruel little jokes, not Marcus, too busy with his business to even show his face on Christmas, was that the family dinner they were hosting that night in the house they called theirs was about to become the last night they would ever call it that. And they had absolutely no idea it was coming. I told Walter everything that had just happened in that room. The gas station poinsettia, the $6 candle, the word my daughter had now used on me twice, 4 years apart, like a signature at the bottom of a document she was certain I would never read. And then I told him, plainly, that I was finished waiting on the bylaws Marcus had spent 2 years quietly restructuring to try to route around my trust's voting shares. A maneuver Walter had, in fact, been tracking from a careful legal distance the entire time, waiting for me to give the word. "Then let me tell you where the listing stands tonight," Walter said, and I could hear papers shuffling on his end of the line, the particular rustle of a man who has spent an entire career keeping other people's affairs in an order they never once had to think about. "That house has been sitting on the open market for 6 weeks now. Real estate agent, photographs, the whole production. Marcus still does not know that the title search is going to come back showing the property has been inside an irrevocable trust since before your husband passed. His agent hasn't found that out yet either, but she will, probably before New Year's." My heart did something complicated at that. Not fear, something closer to the particular cold clarity you feel when a hand you've been holding face down for years is finally about to be shown. "She confirmed the dinner," I told Walter. "Tonight, at the house, exactly the way your contact told you it would be. She stood in my doorway and called it the real family dinner. Since it's theirs now," she said. There was a long pause on Walter's end, and then something I had genuinely never heard from him in 30 years of knowing the man. He laughed, not unkindly, the particular laugh of a lawyer who has just watched a client's opponents walk directly into the exact trap they'd spent years building for themselves without any help required. "Eleanor," Walter said, "how would you feel about coming to your own house for Christmas?" I sat very still on the edge of my narrow bed, in the room that smelled like old people, according to my own daughter, and for the first time in 4 years, I smiled a smile that had nothing sad or small about it at all. I would feel, I said slowly, like it was long past time somebody in that family sat down and actually read the deed. That night, after Walter and I hung up, I did not sleep. I lay awake in the dark listening to Rosalind's television murmuring faintly through the wall, and I thought about Frank, about the letter sitting in Walter's safe all these years, about the particular patience it takes to let people believe they have won so thoroughly that they forget to check whether the game was ever actually theirs to win. I thought about my grandson Tommy, who called every single Sunday, who had never once in 4 years made me feel like a burden or a category or a situation. And I thought about the word my daughter had used like a weapon, twice now, 4 years apart. Alone. I was not alone. I had never actually been alone, not for a single day of those 4 years, though my children had certainly done everything in their considerable power to make sure I felt that way. I had Walter. I had Tommy. I had, as it turned out, an entire quiet infrastructure of loyalty that had been built around me while my own children were too busy building marble countertops to notice. I want to tell you about the years in between, though, because they were not easy, and I do not want you to think this story is only about the triumph at the end. There is nothing satisfying about a victory that costs nothing. Mine cost plenty. The first year at Golden Oaks was the hardest. I will not pretend otherwise. I had lived in my own home for 43 years, and suddenly I was living in a single room with a bed I did not choose, meals I did not cook, and a schedule dictated by staff who meant well, but who did not know that I hated cream of wheat, did not know that I could not sleep without the specific weight of my grandmother's quilt, did not know a single thing about who I actually was before I became a resident with a number on my door. I cried more that first year than I had cried in the previous 20 combined. Not in front of anyone. I want to be clear about that. I cried in the bathroom, with the fan running. The way you learn to grieve quietly when you're afraid that showing your grief will simply give the people who hurt you more evidence that you belong exactly where they put you. Rosalind, my neighbor in 216, found me crying like that one night in the second month, standing in the hallway because I'd forgotten my key card and the bathroom fan situation had become untenable. And instead of being embarrassed for me or pitying me, she simply put her arm around my shoulders and walked me back to her room and made me a cup of tea in a little electric kettle she kept hidden from the staff, who worried about fire code violations more than they worried about 70-year-old women crying alone in hallways at 11 at night. First year's the worst, Rosalind told me that night. She had been at Golden Oaks 3 years longer than I had, placed there by a nephew who inherited her late husband's insurance money and decided, with impressive speed, that his aunt required specialized care, approximately 4 months after the check cleared. After the first year, you stop grieving the life you had, and you start building the life you've got. It's smaller, but it's still a life, and it's still yours. Rosalind became, over those 4 years, something I had not expected to find again at my age. A true friend. We played cards every single evening. We complained about the cream of wheat together, loudly, until the kitchen staff finally relented and started keeping oatmeal on hand specifically for the 2 of us. We covered for each other with the staff when one of us needed an extra hour of quiet, or an extra call to a lawyer that we did not necessarily want the front desk logging in the visitor sheet. Because yes, over those 4 years, I made calls. Careful, quiet calls, on the payphone in the lobby that most residents had forgotten still existed, precisely because it did not show up on any phone bill Denise or Marcus might one day think to check. I called Walter every few months, just to confirm the trust was intact, just to ask quiet questions about Whitfield Precision Components filings, just to make sure the machinery Frank and I had built together, all those years before either of us knew our children would need to be protected from, was still running exactly as designed. And I called Tommy. Every Sunday, without fail, but also, increasingly over those 4 years, at other times too. Times when he'd call me from his lunch break at the warehouse, or from his tiny apartment after a long shift, just to talk, just to check in, just to be the kind of family member who calls because he wants to, not because a folder full of brochures requires it. It was Tommy, in fact, who first told me in year 2 that something was wrong at Whitfield Precision Components. He'd taken a summer job there right out of college, back before his uncle Marcus had fully consolidated control. And even after he left for the warehouse job, he'd kept a few friends inside the company, people from the floor who still talked to him, who still trusted him the way they'd never fully trusted Marcus. "Grandma," Tommy told me one Sunday, his voice careful in the particular way of a young man who is not sure he should be the one delivering bad news. "Danny from the shop floor told me Uncle Marcus laid off 11 people last month, people who'd been there 20 years, said the company's restructuring for growth. But Danny says it doesn't look like growth. Looks like he's been taking money out faster than the company's bringing it in." I remember sitting very still with the phone against my ear, doing the math in my head the way I used to do it at that kitchen table 30 years earlier, back when Frank would slide the ledgers across to me because he trusted my read on the numbers more than his own. 11 longtime employees laid off. Dividend checks that had simply stopped arriving, with 3 separate excuses attached to them. A vice president of family relations who had never worked one single day inside that building. Not one of those 3 facts belonged in the same company as the other 2, unless somebody was quietly carrying money out the back door and calling it growth. "Tommy," I said slowly, "how would you feel about helping your grandmother with something? Something that has to stay between us, at least for now." There was a pause on the line, and then my grandson, 24 years old at the time, said the words that told me everything I needed to know about which of my descendants had actually inherited anything worth having from their grandfather. "Grandma, whatever it is, I'm in. I've watched what they did to you for 2 years now. I'm in." That was the beginning of what became, over the following 2 years, the quietest and most careful alliance of my life. Tommy became my eyes inside a company his own father was slowly hollowing out. Walter became my shield, tracking every legal maneuver Marcus attempted against a trust he did not know existed, quietly ensuring that every single filing, every single attempted title transfer, every single clumsy effort to route around my 41% hit a wall that looked, from Marcus's side, like ordinary bureaucratic delay, and looked, from mine, like a trap slowly closing with total precision. And Nadia, one of the aides at Golden Oaks, a woman in her 30s with 2 kids of her own and more patience than any human being deserves to need, became something I had not expected either: a confidant. She was the one who let me use the staff computer in the break room, off the books, to email Walter documents I needed to review, back when the payphone alone was not going to be enough to manage what was building. She never asked exactly what I was doing. She only ever asked if I needed more time or more privacy or a cup of coffee while I worked. Rosalind, in those years, became something closer to a sister than a mere neighbor down the hall, and I want to tell you a little more about her, Because a story like mine is nothing without the people who quietly held it up while it was still just a plan and a prayer. Rosalind had been placed at Golden Oaks by her nephew, a man named Dwight, who she described, with a dryness that never failed to make me laugh, as generous with everyone's inheritance except his own effort. She had raised 4 children of her own on a schoolteacher's salary after her husband passed, had put every single one of them through college on nights and weekends, and a stubbornness I came to admire more with every year I knew her, and had watched, in her own particular version of my story, as the one child who inherited the least ended up giving her the most. The ones who get the money rarely feel the debt, Rosalind told me once, over cards, in a tone that suggested she had turned this thought over in her mind more times than either of us cared to count. It's the ones who get nothing who remember what they owe you. I don't know why that is. I've had 30 years to figure it out, and I still haven't managed it. She laid a card down, tapped it twice with one finger, and looked at me over the top of her reading glasses. Here's the one thing I did work out, though, Eleanor, and you can have it for free. Being needed is not the same as being loved. Half the women in this building spent 40 years being needed and thought that meant they were safe. I thought about that sentence often, especially on the evenings when Denise's visits left a particular kind of ache behind. The ache of watching someone who owed you everything behave as though they owed you nothing at all. Rosalind never once asked me to explain the calls I made on the lobby payphone, or the documents that occasionally arrived for me through Nadia's careful discretion, though I know she noticed. She noticed everything. She simply chose, again and again, to give me the privacy to build whatever it was I was building, and to be there, unfailingly, with a deck of cards and a pot of decaffeinated coffee, on the nights when the waiting grew heavier than I could carry alone. Tommy's role in those years deepened in ways that, looking back, frightened me a little, because I know now how much I was asking of a young man barely into his 20s. He kept in touch with 3 former co-workers from his summer at Whitfield Precision Components, a machinist named Danny Alvarez, a shipping coordinator named Grace Liu, and an older floor supervisor named Ruben Castellanos, who had worked under Frank himself for nearly 15 years before Marcus took over. None of them knew, at first, that the information they shared with Tommy over beers or lunch breaks was making its way back to me. Tommy was careful about that, more careful than I think either of us fully appreciated at the time, because he understood, instinctively, that if word ever got back to Marcus that his own nephew was quietly gathering intelligence on the company's finances, the consequences for those 3 loyal employees could have been severe. It was Ruben, in the second year, who first mentioned the name of the consulting firm to Tommy, almost in passing, complaining over lunch about how strange it was that the company had started paying some outside consultant nearly $11,000 a month for services nobody on the floor could ever quite identify. Tommy relayed that detail to me on a Sunday call, not thinking much of it at the time, and I remember sitting very still in my room at Golden Oaks, turning that number over in my mind. $11,000 a month. Over a year, that was more than $130,000 flowing out of a company that had, according to Marcus's own explanations to me, barely enough left over to justify a dividend check. I passed that detail to Walter the following week, during one of our quarterly calls, and I remember the particular quality of silence that followed on his end of the line. The silence of a careful man doing careful math. "Eleanor," he said finally, "I want you to keep having Tommy ask around. Gently, never directly, never in a way that puts him at risk. But I think we may be looking at something considerably larger than mismanagement." It took Walter the better part of 8 months, working through public filings, vendor registration records, and a private investigator he retained quietly using funds from my own trust to trace that consulting firm back through 2 shell layers to an entity registered under Craig's name. The same Craig who had never, as far as any of us could determine, held a single professional license or credential that would explain what, exactly, he was being paid so handsomely to consult on. I remember the day Walter called to tell me what he'd found. A gray Wednesday early in the 3rd year, rain streaking the window of my room while Rosalind sat across from me pretending not to listen, though of course she was listening to every word. "It's Craig," Walter said simply. "Denise's husband. The consulting firm belongs to him." I did not say anything for a long moment. Some part of me had suspected, I think, from the very first mention of that $11,000 figure, that this would somehow lead back to my daughter's household rather than a genuine stranger. But suspecting a thing and hearing it confirmed are 2 entirely different sensations. And I remember feeling, in that moment, less anger than a kind of exhausted grief. The grief of a mother realizing that both of her children, not just one, had found their own separate ways to help themselves to what was never theirs. "Do we have enough yet?" I asked Walter, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "Enough to raise serious questions, yes," he said. "Enough to end this cleanly, in the way I think you actually want it ended, not yet. We need the full scope. We need to know how deep this goes, and we need to make sure that when this comes out, it comes out in a way that protects Tommy's job prospects, protects the employees still on that floor, and gives you the moment you deserve, rather than a messy legal scramble that drags on for years." I agreed with him, though agreeing meant more waiting. And by that point in my 4 years at Golden Oaks, waiting had become its own peculiar kind of exhaustion, one that lived in my shoulders and my jaw, and the particular tightness behind my eyes on the nights I could not sleep. But I trusted Walter's judgment the way Frank had trusted it for 30 years, and so I waited, and I kept calling Tommy every Sunday, and I kept playing cards with Rosalind, and I kept, above all else, making absolutely certain that neither Denise nor Marcus ever suspected, for even a single moment, that the quiet old woman in room 214 was doing anything more ambitious than watching game shows and waiting patiently for visits that came less and less often. There was one evening in the 3rd year that came close to unraveling everything, and I think of it still on quiet nights as the moment the entire plan nearly collapsed before it had the chance to finish forming. Denise arrived unannounced, a rare enough occurrence in itself, and found me at the small desk in my room with several pages of Walter's financial summary spread out in front of me, pages I had not heard her keycard in the hallway in time to gather up. "What's all this?" she asked, stepping closer, her eyes moving over the papers with an expression I could not immediately read. My heart was pounding, though I kept my face as still and pleasant as 30 years of practice had taught me to keep it during difficult supplier negotiations. I reached over, unhurried, and gathered the pages into a loose stack, turning them face down with the calm, unbothered motion of a woman tidying up after a crossword puzzle, rather than a woman caught in the middle of building a case against her own children. "Just some old paperwork Walter sent over," I said. "Estate matters, dear. Your father's affairs take longer to settle than anyone tells you they will." Denise's eyes lingered on the stack a moment longer than I would have liked, and I remember holding my breath, certain for one terrible second that she would ask to see the pages, that she would recognize Whitfield Precision Components' letterhead, that 4 years of careful patience were about to collapse in a single careless afternoon. But my daughter, in the end, was saved by her own certainty that her mother had become exactly as harmless and inconsequential as she had long ago decided to believe. "Boring old lawyer stuff," she said, waving a dismissive hand, already reaching for her phone. "You still keeping busy with that, Mom? That's sweet. Gives you something to do, I guess." Something to do. 4 years of careful, patient reconstruction of a fraud that would eventually implicate her own husband, dismissed by my own daughter as something to keep an old woman occupied between meals. I nodded and smiled and let her believe exactly that. And the moment she left, I called Walter immediately from the lobby payphone. My hands, I will admit, not entirely steady. "We need to be more careful," I told him. "She almost saw it today." "Then we'll be more careful," Walter said, his voice as calm as it always was. The calm of a man who had spent 30 years managing far more volatile situations than a startled phone call from a nervous client. "From now on, I'll only send you materials through Nadia's account at the facility. Never anything printed that could be left out where Denise or Marcus might stumble across it. And Eleanor, I want you to hear me say this clearly. Even if she had seen those pages, even if she had asked every question in the world, there was nothing there that could have stopped what we're building. The trust already exists. The documentation already exists. All that would have changed is the timing, not the outcome." I believed him, mostly, though the fear of that afternoon lingered longer than I would have liked to admit. A small, cold reminder tucked into the back of my mind of exactly how much I still had to lose if even one piece of the plan slipped loose before it was ready. It was not long after that close call, in fact, that Nadia's role in all of this deepened from simple kindness into something closer to genuine partnership. Because it became clear, after that frightened phone call from the lobby, that I needed somewhere safer than my own desk drawer to keep the pieces Walter was sending me. "You don't strike me as someone who belongs in a place like this," Nadia told me once, watching me carefully review a document Walter had emailed over about Whitfield Precision Components' third-quarter losses. "No offense to the place, but you strike me as someone who used to run things." "I did run things," I told her. "For 30 years, I ran half of a company nobody remembers I helped build. And I raised 2 children who grew up to believe I never did anything at all." Nadia didn't say anything to that. She just refilled my coffee and let me keep working. And never once, in 2 years of quiet help, asked me for anything in return except my honest company on her breaks, which I was, by then, more than happy to give. I tell you all of this, Rosalind, Tommy, Walter, Nadia, because I want you to understand something important before we go any further into this story. My children believed, for 4 long years, that they had left me alone. They believed a room with a bolted-down television and a plastic wreath on the door was the sum total of what remained of my life. And the entire time, brick by brick, call by call, document by document, I was quietly building something they had absolutely no idea existed. Not a scheme born from bitterness. A foundation, rebuilt slowly, made of the people who had actually shown up, while the people who were supposed to show up were busy deciding I was a problem that had already been solved. By the 3rd year, the picture Walter and I had assembled was clear enough to act on, though I was still not ready, not quite yet, to use what we'd built. Marcus had, over roughly 3 years, drawn down Whitfield Precision Components' cash reserves by nearly $2 million. Close to $400,000 of that had gone out through the consulting contracts, paid to a company that, buried 3 layers deep in its ownership structure, turned out to belong to Denise's husband, a man named Craig, who had, as far as any of us could tell, never actually consulted on anything in his life. The rest my son had simply taken for himself. In bonuses he approved with his own signature, in vehicles the company leased and he drove, in an expense account that had stopped resembling an expense account somewhere around the 2nd year. $2 million. From a company his own father had built with 60 employees and honest invoices and 30 years of never once being late on a single supplier payment. Marcus had turned Frank's legacy into a private piggy bank, and Denise had helped herself to a piece of it through her husband's shell of a consulting firm. And the entire time, both of them had been telling anyone who asked that their mother's 41% was being handled, that the shares would sort themselves out eventually, that I, specifically, did not need to worry my head about complexities I would not understand. Walter, being the careful man he has always been, did not want to move on any of this until we had a plan that would not simply humiliate my children in a courtroom, dragging out for years, costing more in legal fees than it would ever recover, and leaving Tommy, who still worked alongside people at that company who needed their jobs protected, caught in the wreckage of his own father's greed. "What do you actually want out of this, Eleanor?" Walter asked me, in year 3, during one of our increasingly frequent calls. "Because I can get you money. I can get you control of the company back, cleanly, using the trust's voting shares, probably within 6 months if you want to move that fast. But that's not really what you're after, is it?" I thought about that question for a long time before I answered it. What did I actually want? Not revenge, not exactly. Though I will not pretend the idea of my children finally understanding what they had done did not carry its own particular satisfaction. I wanted, more than anything, for the truth to simply become visible. I wanted Denise and Marcus to stand in a room and see, clearly, without any more excuses available to hide behind, exactly what kind of people they had chosen to become, and exactly what it had cost them. "I want them to find out on their own terms," I told Walter finally. "Not in some cold legal filing they can blame on lawyers and technicalities. I want them to find out the way Frank always intended, all at once, in front of the people whose good opinion they actually still care about, with nowhere left to hide from what they did." Walter was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in the voice of a man who has spent 30 years respecting his client's judgment, even when it surprises him, "All right, Eleanor. Then let's build it right. We've got time. Let's not waste it being sloppy." So we waited. Not passively. Every quarter, Walter documented another piece of Marcus's mismanagement. Another consulting invoice paid to Craig's shell company. Another late supplier payment that would have been unthinkable in Frank's day. Tommy kept feeding us the view from the shop floor, watching morale collapse as good workers got laid off to cover the hole in the company's finances that nobody but the 4 of us understood the true size of. And I kept playing cards with Rosalind, kept drinking oatmeal-adjacent breakfasts with Nadia, kept calling Tommy every Sunday, kept letting my daughter walk into my room twice a year and tell me, in various cruel configurations, that I was still here, still alone, still exactly where she'd left me. It is a strange kind of discipline, letting yourself be underestimated on purpose. There were nights I lay awake, furious, wanting simply to call Marcus and tell him I knew everything, wanting to watch his face crumble in real time over the phone, instead of waiting for the moment Walter and I both agreed would actually matter. But Frank had taught me, over 30 years of building a business from nothing, that the people who win are rarely the ones who move fastest. They are the ones who move exactly once, at exactly the right moment, having already made sure there is no way for the other side to recover. By the 4th year, this year, the year of that Christmas Eve visit, the picture was complete. Walter had documentation of every dollar Marcus had diverted. He had the trust paperwork, airtight, predating any attempt either of my children had made to interfere with the house or the shares. He had Frank's sealed letter, still sitting in his office safe, waiting for the word I had promised to give when the time was finally right. And he had, as of 6 weeks earlier, the news that Marcus had listed the family house for sale without knowing that the deed had not, in fact, belonged to him or Denise for 6 years. "There's a closing scheduled," Walter told me, in a call just 2 weeks before that Christmas Eve. December 26th. Marcus found a buyer, a young couple relocating for a job. He's planning to close fast, before year-end, for tax reasons I assume Craig cooked up for him. His agent still hasn't run a full title search past the county clerk's basic filing. Once she does, or once escrow does, this whole thing is going to blow up on its own, with or without us. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed at Golden Oaks, holding the phone, feeling something settle into place inside me that had been unsettled for 4 long years. "Walter," I said, "I don't want it to blow up on its own. I want to be standing there when it does." Walter laughed that same rare laugh again. "Eleanor Whitfield, are you telling me you want to crash your own house's closing?" "I'm telling you," I said, "that I want my family to open Frank's letter in the house he built for them, on the day they think they've finally gotten rid of me for good. I want it to happen in front of everyone who matters to them, and I want it to happen soon." Walter was quiet for a long moment, and then he said the words that set everything that followed into motion. "The closing's set for the 26th, but Denise mentioned to the real estate agent, according to my contact, that they're hosting one last family Christmas dinner at the house on Christmas Eve, 2 nights before the new owners take possession. A sort of goodbye party, apparently. Sentimental for a woman who put her own mother in a home 4 years ago. Sentimental. My daughter, who had spent 4 years reducing me to a category, wanted one last sentimental night in the house she believed was finally, fully, permanently hers, 2 nights before she signed it away to strangers for a profit she and Marcus had no legal right to pocket in the first place. "Then that's when we do it," I said. "Christmas Eve, in the house, in front of whoever they've invited." What Denise did not know, walking out of my room that Christmas Eve with her cheap vanilla candle and her cruel little laugh, was that the only thing still standing between her goodbye party and 4 years of patient preparation had been my own willingness to keep waiting a little longer, and she had just laughed the last of that willingness right out of me. She thought she was hosting a goodbye party for a house she'd successfully stolen. She had no idea she was hosting the one night that would finally end the lie she and her brother had been living inside for 4 years. I called Walter back within the hour, sitting in the lobby by the payphone, while Rosalind kept watch for any staff who might wonder why I was suddenly making so many calls in 1 week. "Christmas Eve," I told him. "Tonight, we need to move." "Eleanor," Walter said, and I could hear, for the first time in 30 years of knowing this careful, methodical man, something like genuine excitement in his voice. "I've been ready to move for 4 years. Just tell me what you need and I'll have it in place by 6 o'clock tonight." What I needed, it turned out, was fairly simple, though it required calling in every quiet favor I had built over 4 patient years. I needed Tommy to drive me. I needed Walter to bring Frank's letter and every piece of documentation he'd assembled, and, if he was willing, to bring along a colleague of his, a real estate attorney named Priscilla Ondo, who specialized in exactly the kind of title disputes that were about to detonate in the middle of my family's living room. And I needed one more thing, something Walter, in his careful 30-year way, had already anticipated before I even asked. "I took the liberty," Walter said, "of reaching out to Detective Renata Castillo. She used to be a fraud investigator before she moved to detective work, and she owes me a favor from a case 15 years back. If what we suspect about the consulting payments to Craig's shell company holds up under a closer look, this isn't just a family embarrassment anymore, Eleanor. This is criminal fraud against a company with 60 former employees who deserved better. I think you should know that before we walk in that door tonight." I sat with that for a long moment. Criminal fraud. My own son. My own daughter's husband. I thought about the 11 employees laid off to cover a hole Marcus had dug for himself. About the 30 years Frank had spent building a reputation for honest dealing in an industry that did not always reward honesty. About what it would mean for that legacy to end not just in family betrayal, but in an actual criminal case. "Do it," I said finally. Frank built that company on honesty. If Marcus destroyed it with lies, then the lies need to be answered for. All the way. That evening, Tommy picked me up from Golden Oaks in his old Honda Civic, the same one he'd been driving since college, and as I settled into the passenger seat, wearing not the cardigan Denise had once mocked, but a simple charcoal wool coat Rosalind had insisted I borrow for the occasion, my grandson looked over at me with an expression somewhere between nervousness and fierce, quiet pride. "You ready for this, Grandma?" he asked. I looked out at the snow falling steadily over the parking lot, at the Christmas lights strung along the entrance to a building that had been my address for 4 years, but had never once, not for a single day, been my home. "Tommy," I said, "I have been ready for this for exactly 4 years. 365 days a year. Let's go." And with that, we pulled out of the Golden Oaks parking lot, following Walter's car and Detective Castillo's unmarked sedan through the snow-lined streets toward the house Frank and I had built our whole life inside of. The house my daughter believed she had already claimed for good. The house that was about to become, for one final, unforgettable night, the site of the exact reckoning my late husband had spent his last months on Earth quietly preparing. The house looked exactly the same from the outside, which surprised me more than I expected it to. 4 years, and the porch light still burned the same warm yellow over the same brick steps. Someone, probably Denise, had strung white icicle lights along the gutter line, the kind Frank had always refused to bother with because he said real Christmas spirit didn't come from an extension cord. Through the front windows, I could see the glow of a fire in the hearth I had chosen the stones for myself, back in 1987, and shapes moving inside, laughing, holding glasses, entirely unaware that the woman they had discarded was sitting in a car at the curb, watching them enjoy one last evening in a house that had never actually belonged to them. "How many cars do you count?" Walter asked, leaning out of his own car window into the cold as Tommy idled behind him. I did not answer him right away. I sat there instead, in the passenger seat of Tommy's old Honda, engine ticking as it cooled in the cold, and I let myself look at that house the way I had not allowed myself to look at anything in 4 years. Really look. Not the quick, guarded glance I gave photographs Tommy occasionally showed me on his phone, always careful to change the subject before the ache could settle in fully. This was different. This was the actual house, close enough to touch, snow gathering softly on the same black shutters Frank and I had argued about for a full week in 1991, before finally agreeing on the color. Close enough that I could see, even through the frost creeping along the edges of the car window, the exact place along the side fence where my rose bushes still grew. Bare now for winter, but unmistakably mine, planted with my own 2 hands the spring after Tommy was born. I remembered that spring so clearly it startled me. Tommy had been 6 weeks old, colicky, refusing to sleep unless someone walked him in slow circles around the downstairs rooms, and I had spent whole afternoons pushing his stroller along that same side yard, while Denise, 24 years old herself then, and utterly exhausted, napped upstairs for the first uninterrupted hour she'd had in weeks. I had planted those roses one-handed, Tommy balanced on my hip, humming to him the same tune Frank used to hum in the machine shop when a job was going well. I had not thought of that particular afternoon in years, and it arrived now, unbidden, with a force that nearly undid the composure I had spent 4 years building for exactly this moment. "Grandma," Tommy said quietly, watching my face in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "You okay?" I nodded, though I do not think either of us fully believed the nod. "I am remembering a great many things all at once," I told him honestly. "It is a strange sensation, coming home to a place you were never meant to see again." Snow had begun falling more steadily while we sat there, fat, unhurried flakes drifting down through the porch light in a way that would have looked, under any other circumstances, like the opening of a Christmas card. I watched one land on the windshield directly in front of me and dissolve slowly into a small, clear bead of water. And I thought, with the particular clarity grief sometimes grants you at the strangest moments, that Frank had loved snow exactly like this. Quiet, steady, unbothered by anything happening beneath it. He used to stand at the kitchen window on nights like this one, coffee in hand, and tell me that snow was the only weather patient enough to cover up every mistake a man made in his yard that year. At least until spring forced the truth back into view. I found myself thinking, absurdly, of the Christmas Eve 30 years earlier, when Frank had insisted on stringing lights along the roofline himself, despite my repeated warnings that the ladder was unsteady on the frozen grass, and had fallen, gently enough that nothing but his pride was injured, directly into the very rosebed I would not plant for another 4 years. He had lain there laughing, snow soaking through his coat, until I came out with a flashlight and found him grinning up at the sky like a man who had just discovered something wonderful instead of something foolish. That was the kind of house this had been. Not perfect, not without its arguments and its overdrawn accounts in the lean years and its long silences after a hard day at the shop, but warm, in the particular way a house becomes warm only after decades of ordinary living have soaked into its walls the way heat soaks into stone. And now, through those same windows, I could see figures moving that had no idea what warmth actually meant, laughing over wine glasses in a room my husband and I had built with our own savings and our own hands, treating the house's final evening as though it were a party thrown in their own honor, rather than the last night of a lie finally catching up with them. "Eleanor," Walter said again, gently this time, still leaning out of his car window into the falling snow, patient in the way he had always been patient with me, 30 years of careful, professional distance never once curdling into impatience, even now, at the very edge of everything we had built together. "Take your time. We are not going anywhere until you are ready. But I do want to know what we're walking into." I thought, briefly, of Rosalind, tucked back at Golden Oaks that very moment, having insisted, despite my protests, that I take her good charcoal coat instead of my own thinner one, saying only, "You are not walking into that house looking like a woman anyone can feel sorry for." I thought of Nadia, who had signed me out at the front desk herself for the evening and left the family contact column of the log blank without a single question asked, simply squeezing my hand before I left and saying, "Go get what's yours, Miss Eleanor." I thought of the 4 years of Sundays, every single one of them, when Tommy had called simply because he wanted to hear my voice, never once needing a reason beyond love itself. I thought of Frank's letter, sitting in Walter's coat pocket at that very moment, sealed for 6 years, waiting for exactly this night to finally speak in his voice one last time. And I thought, with a clarity that steadied my hands entirely, of the exact words my daughter had said to me that same afternoon in that narrow room that smelled, according to her, like old people. Still alone, LOL. 4 years of small cruelties, distilled down into 3 syllables and an abbreviation, delivered with a laugh on her way out the door. I was not alone. I had never been alone, not for a single one of those 4 years, though it had cost me everything I had to let my children believe otherwise, long enough for this exact moment to arrive fully formed. I breathed in slowly, the cold air sharp and clean in a way the recycled air of Golden Oaks never quite managed to be, and I made myself look at the house one final time before I answered Walter's question, cataloging it the way Frank had once taught me to catalog a supplier's warehouse before a difficult negotiation, methodically, without sentiment clouding the details that would actually matter once we were inside. I counted 6 vehicles along the curb and driveway. Marcus's Audi, the same one Denise had once described to me admiringly years ago, without ever mentioning where the money for it had actually come from. Denise's own car, a sedan I didn't recognize, likely Craig's. 2 more cars I guessed belonged to the young couple set to close on the house the morning after Christmas, brought along, no doubt, for some sentimental final walkthrough before the ink dried, and a 6th car, older, modest, that I would later learn belonged to Marcus's assistant, a young woman named Priya, who, it turned out, had been quietly horrified by what she'd been asked to help paper over for the past 2 years, and who would end up being one of the more unexpectedly important witnesses of that entire night. 6, I said. Good. Let's not keep them waiting on Christmas Eve. Detective Castillo had explained, on the drive over, exactly how she wanted this handled. She was there in an unofficial capacity for now, she said, present as a favor to Walter and as a quiet observer, not making any arrests unless the evidence in front of her that night gave her clear legal grounds to act immediately. Priscilla Ondo, the title attorney, carried a folder thick with the trust documentation, ready to answer any legal challenge Marcus's real estate agent might raise about the sale's validity. And Walter carried, in a plain manila envelope that had sat locked in his office safe for 6 years, the sealed letter Frank had written the year before he died. I walked up those brick steps for the first time in 4 years, my grandson's arm steady under mine, my old friend and my new allies close behind, and I did not knock. I still had a key. Walter had quietly retrieved it from the trust's records months earlier, in case exactly this moment ever came. The door opened onto the front hall, and the noise inside stopped almost instantly, the way a room goes silent when something impossible walks into it. Denise was standing near the fireplace, holding a glass of wine, wearing a dark green dress I did not recognize, and her face, when she turned and saw me standing in the doorway of the house I had built and she had stolen, went through an entire sequence of expressions in under 2 seconds. Confusion, recognition, and then, unmistakably, fear. "Mom?" she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the single syllable. The first time in 4 years I had heard anything in her voice that resembled the daughter I remembered, instead of the woman who had replaced her. How did you— "Merry Christmas, Denise," I said, and I kept my voice level, calm, the way Frank always kept his voice on the factory floor when a machine had failed and 60 employees were watching to see whether the man in charge would panic or lead. "I thought it was about time I came home for the holiday." Marcus appeared from the kitchen doorway, a beer in his hand, and when he saw me standing in the front hall with Walter Briggs beside me, I watched the color drain out of his face with a speed that told me, more clearly than any document ever could, exactly how much he already suspected was coming for him. "Walter," Marcus said, his voice tight, forcing something that was trying very hard to sound casual and failing completely. "This is a surprise. We're kind of in the middle of a family evening here." "It certainly is a family evening," Walter said pleasantly, stepping into the front hall behind me with the ease of a man who had waited 30 years to say exactly what he was about to say. "In fact, I don't think there's ever been a more appropriate family evening for what I'm here to discuss." A young couple I didn't recognize stood awkwardly near the staircase, clearly the buyers, clearly sensing that whatever was about to happen in this room was not the sentimental farewell dinner they'd been invited to observe. Craig, Denise's husband, had gone very still by the drinks cart, his glass halfway to his mouth, frozen there like a man who had just heard a sound he desperately hoped was nothing. "Everyone?" Denise said, her voice climbing half an octave higher than usual as she tried, visibly, to regain control of a room that had already slipped entirely out of her hands. "This is my mother. She lives at a lovely facility. I'm sure she just wanted to see the house one more time before you sell it out from under me?" I asked, and I let the question sit in the room exactly as long as it needed to, watching my daughter's face go pale under the fireplace light. "Is that the sentence you were about to finish, Denise?" The room had gone completely silent, the kind of silence you can feel pressing against your eardrums. And into that silence, Walter Briggs stepped forward, opened his briefcase on the front hall table Frank and I had bought at an estate sale 38 years ago, and began to lay out, one document at a time, everything he and I had spent 4 patient years assembling. "For those of you who don't know me," Walter said, his voice carrying easily through the stunned quiet of the room, "my name is Walter Briggs. I've been the Whitfield family attorney for 30 years, and I was Frank Whitfield's personal attorney until the day he passed. I'm here tonight because 6 years ago, Frank and Eleanor Whitfield placed this house and Eleanor's 41% ownership stake in Whitfield Precision Components into an irrevocable trust, naming their grandson Tommy as sole beneficiary, with myself as trustee, and with Eleanor's right to occupy this house for the remainder of her natural life written into the second page of that document." "That's not," Marcus started, his voice cracking. "That's not possible. The deed is in Mom's name. The deed," Walter said, calmly pulling a document from his briefcase and setting it on the hall table, "has been held in trust since April of 6 years ago. Which means, Marcus, that when you listed this house for sale 6 weeks ago, you listed a property you have never, not for one single day, had any legal authority to sell." The young couple by the staircase exchanged a look of pure horror. The look of people realizing in real time that the closing they'd been planning to attend in 2 days had just evaporated into nothing. Craig set his drink down on the cart with a small, unsteady clink, and I watched him do the math, watched him understand, faster than either Denise or Marcus seemed to, exactly how much trouble was about to land on all of their heads at once. "This is insane," Denise said, her voice rising now, genuine panic finally cracking through the composure she'd worn like armor for 4 years. "Mom, you can't just walk in here and… This is our house. We've lived here. We've paid the taxes. You've paid the taxes on a house that legally belongs to a trust established for your own son," Priscilla Ondo said, stepping forward with her own folder, her voice crisp and entirely unmoved by Denise's rising panic. "Which, incidentally, means any funds you used from this property's equity, any loans taken against it, any attempt to transfer title to a buyer, constitutes a significant legal problem that goes well beyond a simple family dispute." I watched my daughter's face as this landed, watched 4 years of certainty collapse in real time, watched the particular horror of a woman realizing that every single confident, cruel thing she had said to me over 4 Christmases, every still alone, every LOL, every casual reminder that this house was hers now, had been built on a foundation that had never actually existed. "There's more," Walter said quietly, and I felt my chest tighten, because I knew what was coming next, and I had been waiting 6 years to watch this particular truth land in this particular room. Walter reached into his briefcase one final time and withdrew a plain envelope, yellowed slightly at the edges, sealed with wax the way Frank had always sealed important documents, a small habit of his that used to make me tease him for being 100 years old inside a middle-aged man's body. "Frank wrote this letter the year before he passed," Walter said, holding it up so the whole room could see it. "He asked me to keep it sealed until Eleanor decided the time was right to open it. Eleanor, would you like to do the honors? Or would you like me to read it?" I looked at that envelope, at my late husband's handwriting on the front, simply reading, "To my family, when it matters." And I felt 6 years of grief and 4 years of quiet, patient endurance rise up in my chest all at once. I took the envelope from Walter's hands. My fingers were steady. I had waited a very long time to be steady in this exact moment. "I'll read it," I said. I broke the wax seal, and I unfolded 3 pages of my husband's handwriting. The same handwriting that used to sign my birthday cards, the same handwriting that used to leave notes on the kitchen counter before early shifts at the shop. And I began to read. "To Marcus and Denise," Frank had written. "If you are hearing this letter, it means your mother has decided the time has come for you to finally understand something I have known for a very long time, and hoped every single day of my life that I would never actually need to tell you." The room was utterly silent. Even the fire seemed to have gone quiet, though I know that is only how memory shapes these moments in hindsight. I built Whitfield precision components with my own 2 hands, but I did not build it alone. Your mother sat beside me at that kitchen table for 15 years before we could afford real accountants, and every major decision this company ever made, she was part of. When I am gone, I want you both to remember that the woman you have spent your whole lives underestimating is the same woman who signed the loan papers that saved this company in 1991, when 2 different bankers told me it couldn't be done. I paused there, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, and looked up at my children. Marcus had gone completely white. Denise had a hand pressed against her mouth, tears already gathering, though whether from grief or from the particular horror of realizing exactly what her father had known about her all along, I could not yet tell. "I love you both," the letter continued. "More than either of you will likely ever fully understand, because I know that loving a child does not always mean liking who they eventually become. I have watched you both, in recent years, begin to treat your mother as though her only remaining value is whatever can be extracted from her quietly, while she is too tired or too polite to notice. I want you to know that I noticed, and I made sure, long before I died, that nothing either of you could ever take from her would actually belong to you." I paused there, letting that sentence settle into the room the way sediment settles at the bottom of still water, and I looked up from the page for a long moment before continuing. I wanted to see their faces. I had waited 6 years to see their faces in exactly this instant, and I was not going to rush past it simply because the silence had grown heavy enough to feel unbearable. Craig had gone very still by the drinks cart, his glass forgotten in his hand, ice slowly melting into the amber liquid while he stared at some fixed point on the carpet that clearly offered him no comfort at all. Priya, Marcus's assistant, stood near the kitchen doorway with her coat still buttoned to the throat, as though some part of her had already decided she might need to leave quickly, and her eyes moved between Marcus and the letter in my hands with an expression I can only describe as quiet, dawning vindication. The look of someone who has spent 2 years suspecting a truth she was never given permission to say out loud. The young couple by the staircase, the ones who had come expecting nothing more complicated than a sentimental farewell dinner before their closing, stood frozen in a posture of pure second-hand mortification, the woman's hand gripping her partner's sleeve so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. I felt for them again, briefly, the way you feel for strangers caught in weather they did not check the forecast for. But I did not stop reading for their comfort. This letter had not been written for them. The fire popped once, sharply, sending a small shower of sparks against the screen, and I remember flinching slightly at the sound, the way you flinch at anything sudden when every nerve in your body has spent the last several minutes drawn as tight as a wire. Tommy's hand had not left my shoulder. I could feel, through the wool of Rosalind's borrowed coat, the particular steadiness of a young man determined not to let his grandmother stand alone in this moment even for a single second, though he had not said a word since we walked through the door. I thought, in that suspended silence, of the afternoon Frank had written these very pages, 6 years earlier, at the kitchen table in the next room over, the same table where I had once overheard my children discussing my disappearance through a phone I should never have picked up. Frank had sat there for the better part of an entire Saturday, refusing my offers of coffee, refusing even Walter's suggestion that he dictate the letter instead of writing it by hand, insisting, in the stubborn way that had built an entire company out of nothing, that some things needed to come directly from a man's own hand, or they did not count as truly coming from him at all. "They're going to hate hearing this," I had told him that day, watching him cross out a line and rewrite it more carefully. "Frank, they're going to hate you for it." He had looked up at me then, his reading glasses slipping down his nose the way they always did by mid-afternoon, and said something I had carried with me every single day since, through 4 Christmases in a narrow room, through every dividend check that stopped arriving, through every small cruelty my children handed me disguised as concern. "Eleanor, I have spent 30 years building things that last. A company, a house, a marriage, God willing, that outlasted every hard year we ever had to claw our way through together. I am not going to spend the last thing I ever write to my children pretending their mother was less than she was, just so they can go on being comfortable a little while longer. Comfortable lies are still lies. I would rather they hate me for the truth than love a version of their father who lied to protect their convenience. I had not fully understood, sitting across from him that Saturday afternoon, exactly how much weight those words would eventually carry. I understood it now. Standing in the same house 6 years later, my son sunk into a silence heavier than any I had ever heard from him. My daughter's hand still pressed against her mouth as though she were trying, physically, to hold back whatever sound was building behind it. Detective Castillo stood near the front door, arms folded, saying nothing, watching the room with the particular patience of a woman who has learned, over a long career, that some of the most important evidence in any case arrives not through documents, but through the exact way a guilty person's face changes when they finally understand they have been caught. Priscilla Ondo had gone still as well, her folder of trust documents held loosely at her side, no longer needed in that instant, because no legal argument in the world could have carried the same weight as a dead man's own handwriting. I thought, too, of Rosalind, waiting back at Golden Oaks with her deck of cards and her borrowed coat now wrapped around my shoulders, who had told me once, in the hallway on one of my hardest nights, that grief and vindication sometimes arrive dressed exactly alike, and that a person could not always tell the two apart until months afterward, looking back. I understood, in that moment, precisely what she had meant. My chest ached with something that was not quite triumph and not quite sorrow, but some third, unnamed thing that lived in the narrow space between them. Denise finally lowered her hand from her mouth, though she did not speak. Her eyes, red-rimmed now, moved from my face to the letter and back again, as though she were searching for some sign that this was a misunderstanding that could still, somehow, be untangled before it became permanent. I did not offer her that sign. There was none to give. I drew a slow breath, steadier than I had any right to feel, and let my eyes drop back down to Frank's handwriting, to the next line waiting patiently on the page exactly where he had left it 6 years earlier, written for this exact night, for this exact room, for these exact 2 children standing in the wreckage of everything they had assumed was already, permanently, theirs. Marcus made a small sound, something between a word and a breath, and sank slowly onto the arm of the sofa, his beer forgotten on the side table. "The house is not yours," Frank's letter continued. "It never was, not for one single day since I signed it into trust. The company's true controlling shares are not yours either, and if you are hearing this letter read out loud at all, I would wager the last honest dollar I ever earned that one of you has already gone looking for a way around that and found out there isn't one. Everything of real value in this family sits inside a trust your mother and I built together. Her home, for as long as she lives in it, and after that, Denise's boy Tommy. I am putting his name on it while he is still young enough that nobody can accuse him of asking, because I already suspect he will still be picking up a telephone to call his grandmother on Sundays, long after the 2 of you have decided that a visit or so a year is generous enough." I looked up from the page and found Tommy standing near the doorway, his eyes wet, his jaw tight, and I understood in that moment exactly how much this letter, written 6 years before he'd have any way of knowing its contents, was also a gift to him. Proof that his grandfather had seen, even from beyond his own death, exactly who his grandson would grow up to become. "If you are hearing this letter," the final paragraph read, It means your mother finally decided you had earned the truth. I hope, more than anything, that whatever brought her to this decision was not cruelty on your part. But I suspect, knowing both of you as well as I did, that it probably was. I am sorry it came to this. I am not sorry I protected her. Love, your father, Frank. I folded the letter slowly and set it down on the hall table. And for a long moment, nobody in that room said anything at all. The fire crackled. Somewhere upstairs, a clock I recognized as my own, one Frank had bought me for our 20th anniversary, chimed softly for the hour. "Mom," Denise finally said, her voice small in a way I had not heard since she was a child. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about the trust. I thought—" "You thought," I said, and my voice, for the first time that night, hardened into something I had been holding back for 4 long years. That I was old and tired and alone, and that I would simply sit quietly in a room you chose for me while you took everything your father and I built together. You said it to my face, Denise, twice. Once 4 years ago, standing in this very house, and again this afternoon in that room you keep telling me smells like old people. You said, "Still alone." You said it like a punchline. Denise flinched, actually flinched, like the words had struck her physically. "I want you to understand something," I continued, and I felt Tommy's hand find my shoulder, steady, warm. Exactly the kind of support neither of my children had thought to offer me in 4 years. I was never alone, not for a single day. I had Walter. I had Rosalind, my dear friend at Golden Oaks, who has more loyalty in her little finger than either of you have shown me in 4 years combined. I had Nadia, who let me work quietly on the very documents that just exposed both of you tonight. And I had Tommy, who called me every Sunday, who never once made me feel like a burden, who is the only one of my 3 grandchildren who bothered to actually know me as a person instead of a category to be managed. Rosalind told me something once, over a deck of cards, in a building the 2 of you picked out for me. She said, "Being needed is not the same as being loved." I sat with that sentence for 4 years, Denise, and I finally understood what I had been to you both. Not a mother. An account you had not gotten around to closing yet. Marcus finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Mom, the company. I can explain the consulting contracts. It wasn't what it looks like." "Detective Castillo," Walter said quietly, gesturing toward the woman who had been standing near the front door this entire time, silent, observant, letting the family drama play out before stepping forward with the weight of an actual badge behind her words. "Would like to ask you a few questions about those consulting contracts, Marcus. Whenever you're ready." Marcus's face, at the sight of the detective stepping forward, went the color of ash. Craig, standing frozen by the drinks cart this entire time, set his glass down and took a single step toward the front door before Detective Castillo's voice, calm and utterly unhurried, stopped him cold. "I wouldn't," she said simply. "We can do this here, tonight, with your families present, or we can do it downtown, tomorrow, on Christmas. Your choice. But I suspect you'd both prefer the first option." Craig sat back down, slowly, the way a man sits when his legs have simply stopped fully cooperating with the rest of his body. The young couple who had come to celebrate their impending home purchase stood frozen near the staircase throughout all of this, and I felt, even in the middle of my own long-delayed reckoning, a flicker of sympathy for them. They had done nothing wrong. They had simply wanted a home, and found themselves, entirely by accident, standing in the exact center of a family's collapse. "I want you both to know," I said, turning toward them gently, "that none of this is your fault. I'm sorry your evening turned into this, but this house was never truly for sale, and I want to make sure, before anyone leaves tonight, that you understand exactly why, so there's no confusion moving forward." The young woman, visibly shaken, nodded. "We had no idea," she said quietly. "We're so sorry. We didn't mean to—" "You have nothing to apologize for," I told her. "You were simply trying to buy an honest home from people who, it turns out, did not have an honest thing to sell you." Denise made a small, wounded sound at that, but I did not look at her. I had spent 4 years absorbing every cruel thing my daughter had chosen to say to me, and I was done, in that moment, giving her cruelty any more of my attention than it had already stolen. Detective Castillo spent the better part of the next hour right there in my living room, walking Marcus and Craig through the specific documentation Walter had assembled over the previous 2 years. The consulting payments routed to Craig's shell company, the layoffs used to disguise a cash shortfall that had nothing to do with market conditions, and everything to do with 2 men quietly draining a company that 60 families had once depended on for their livelihoods. I watched my son's face collapse, piece by piece, as every excuse he tried to offer was met with a document that had already anticipated it. "This isn't a formal arrest," Detective Castillo said finally, closing her notebook. "Not tonight, not on Christmas Eve, in front of your families. But I want to be very clear with both of you. This is now an active fraud investigation, and I expect full cooperation starting the day after Christmas. I'd strongly recommend both of you retain your own separate legal counsel, because I don't think either of you is going to want to be sharing a lawyer with the other by the time this is finished." Marcus put his head in his hands. Denise was crying openly now, the mascara she'd applied so carefully before her guests arrived running in dark tracks down her cheeks. "And I want to be honest with you about something in this moment, because I promised myself, long ago, that if I ever told this story, I would tell it truthfully. I did not feel triumphant watching my daughter cry. I felt something far more complicated. Grief, mostly. Grief for the daughter I had raised, who had once been a little girl who cried when she stepped on ants by accident, who had somehow grown into a woman capable of standing in a doorway telling her own mother, twice, 4 years apart, that she was still alone, and laughing about it. "Mom," Denise said finally, her voice raw, stripped of every ounce of the composure she'd worn like armor for 4 years. "What happens now? To the house, to us, to—" "The house belongs to Tommy," I said simply. "It always has, since before your father died. As for what happens to the 2 of you, that is genuinely between you and Detective Castillo, and whatever attorneys you retain to help you answer for what you did to your father's company and the 60 people who depended on it." "And to me?" Denise asked, quieter now, almost childlike. "What happens to me and you?" I looked at my daughter for a long moment, at the woman who had once been the little girl I rocked to sleep during thunderstorms, who I had taught to ride a bicycle in the very driveway outside this window, who had somehow become someone capable of such casual, repeated cruelty toward the mother who raised her. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "I am not interested in punishing you forever, Denise. I am your mother, and some part of me will always love you, whether or not you deserve it, because that is simply what loving a child means. But I am also done being someone you can discard and then visit twice a year to remind that she's still alone. If you want any kind of relationship with me going forward, it will require more than an apology tonight. It will require years of proving, the way Tommy has already proven, that you actually mean it." Marcus, still sitting with his head in his hands, finally looked up. "Mom," he said, his voice thick. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't undo 4 years. But I am sorry." I nodded slowly. "I believe that you're sorry, Marcus. Tonight, in this room, with a detective standing 3 feet away from you, I believe you are very sorry indeed. Whether you would have been sorry without all of that, I genuinely do not know. And I think, if you're honest with yourself, you don't fully know either." The young couple quietly excused themselves not long after, offering awkward, sincere condolences to a family they had only met that evening under the worst possible circumstances. And I found myself, oddly, hoping they'd find a good, honest house somewhere else, one without 6 years of hidden fraud buried underneath its foundation. Walter and Priscilla stayed another hour, handling the practical matters that follow a night like that one, explaining to Marcus and Denise, in careful legal language, exactly what would happen in the coming weeks. The listing would be withdrawn immediately. The title dispute resolved in the trust's clear favor within days, not months. Whitfield Precision Components books would be turned over, formally, to a forensic accountant Walter had already retained, working alongside Detective Castillo's investigation to determine the full extent of what had been taken and what could still be recovered for the employees who had lost their jobs to cover it. Detective Castillo left last, pausing at the door to speak to me privately, out of earshot of my children. "You did something tonight most people don't have the patience for," she said quietly. 4 years is a long time to wait for the right moment." "It felt longer," I told her honestly. "But I had good reasons to wait, and good people helping me do it." When the house finally emptied, when Marcus and Denise and Craig had all left in a silence far heavier than the one they'd walked in with 3 hours earlier, it was just Tommy, Rosalind, who I had asked Nadia to bring over quietly an hour into the evening, Walter, and me, standing in the living room of the house Frank and I had built our entire life inside of. Rosalind, ever practical, was already in the kitchen putting on a kettle for tea, moving through my old house with the easy comfort of a woman who understood exactly how strange and exactly how necessary this night had been. "Grandma," Tommy said, sitting down beside me on the sofa, the same sofa Frank had fallen asleep on most Sunday afternoons of our marriage. "The house is really mine? Like, actually, legally, right now?" "It has been for 6 years," I told him, smiling for what felt like the first time in months without any complicated grief attached to it. "Your grandfather made sure of that a long time before either of us knew you'd grow up to be the only one of your generation worth trusting with it." Tommy's eyes filled with tears, and he leaned his head against my shoulder the way he used to when he was small, before his mother's ambitions had started reshaping the family into something colder than the one I remembered raising. "I want you to live here," he said quietly. "Not me alone in this big house. You. This was always your home, Grandma. I don't want it back unless you're in it." I put my arm around my grandson in the house my husband built, on the Christmas Eve that had finally, after 4 long years, become exactly the reckoning Frank always intended it to be. And for the first time since he passed, I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as whole. The weeks that followed moved faster than 4 years of waiting had ever prepared me for. Detective Castillo's fraud investigation expanded quickly once the forensic accountant Walter retained finished tracing every dollar Marcus had taken out of that company. The consulting invoices routed to Craig's shell firm, the bonuses my son had approved with his own signature, the leases, the cards, the whole quiet arithmetic of it. The final figure came to just under $2,300,000 over roughly 3 years, money that should have gone toward payroll, toward supplier contracts, toward the 60 employees who had built their careers and their families' security around Whitfield Precision Components' continued honest operation. Marcus was charged in early February with wire fraud and embezzlement, charges that carried the very real possibility of prison time, given the scale of what investigators eventually uncovered. Craig, facing his own charges as the recipient of the fraudulent consulting payments, chose to cooperate fully with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, a decision that, I later learned, caused a rift between him and Denise so severe that she moved out of their house within the month, unable to forgive him for what she called, with an irony I do not think she fully recognized, choosing himself over the family. Denise herself was not charged criminally. She had known about the consulting payments, according to the evidence, but had not directly orchestrated the fraud the way Marcus and Craig had, and prosecutors ultimately determined there was insufficient evidence to pursue charges against her specifically. But the civil consequences were their own kind of reckoning. The house was gone, restored fully and legally to Tommy within 3 weeks of that Christmas Eve. Marcus's role at Whitfield Precision Components ended immediately, replaced by a board that Walter and I appointed together, using the trust's controlling voting shares, a board that brought in an outside CEO within 2 months, a steady, honest woman named Karen Okafor, who had spent 15 years turning around struggling manufacturing companies exactly like this one. The 60 employees Frank had once employed had, by that point, dwindled to 31. But under Karen's leadership, and with the trust shares now genuinely working in the company's interest instead of one family's private benefit, Whitfield Precision Components began, slowly, to rebuild. Within a year, it had rehired 9 of the 11 employees Marcus had laid off, men and women who had spent decades on that shop floor and deserved far better than what my son's greed had cost them. I want to tell you about the smaller moments, too, because they mattered as much to me, in the end, as the larger reckoning did. Rosalind moved out of Golden Oaks 4 months after that Christmas Eve, into a small guest cottage on the property behind Tommy's house, the same property that had once been mine and was now, by the plain language on the second page of Frank's trust, mine to live in for the rest of my life. We still play cards every single evening. The staff at Golden Oaks still ask me, whenever I visit to see old friends, whether I miss the place. And I tell them honestly that I miss the people, and nothing else about it at all. Nadia, the aide who had let me use the break room computer for 2 quiet years, without ever once asking exactly what I was hiding, left Golden Oaks the following spring to start nursing school, something she'd wanted to do for a decade, but had never had the savings to pursue. I paid for it, quietly, the way I do most things now, through a small scholarship fund Walter helped me set up in Frank's name, one that has since helped 4 other caregivers at that same facility pursue educations they'd put off for years while caring for other people's families instead of building their own futures. Tommy still calls me every Sunday, though now, instead of calling a facility phone line, he simply walks down the hall of the house we share, and we have our Sunday conversation over breakfast instead of over a landline. He finished the certification he'd abandoned years earlier when the job market disappointed him, using some of the money that came, eventually, from the restructured shares of Whitfield Precision Components, shares that the trust now directs, in part, specifically toward funding his education and his future. Exactly as his grandfather intended 6 years before either of them fully understood why it mattered. Marcus is currently serving a 4-year sentence, and I visit him twice a year, at Christmas and on his birthday. Because whatever else my son has become, he is still my son, and Frank's letter never asked me to stop loving my children. It only asked me to stop letting them take what was never rightfully theirs to take. Marcus and I do not speak much during those visits. Mostly I sit with him in silence, and sometimes he cries, and sometimes I do too. And I think, in its own quiet, complicated way, that is its own kind of ongoing reckoning, one that will take him considerably longer than one Christmas Eve to fully work through. Denise I see even less often. She moved across the state after the divorce finalized, took a job in retail management, started, according to Tommy, who still speaks with her occasionally out of a loyalty I both admire and gently worry about, a kind of slow, halting therapy that he describes as actually seeming real this time. She wrote me a letter last spring, a real letter, not a text message punctuated with cruel abbreviations, in which she apologized, at genuine length, for the specific words she'd used that final Christmas Eve, and for the 4 years of visits before it that had made those words possible. I have not fully forgiven her. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think stories like mine too often rush toward a tidy forgiveness that real life rarely offers so cleanly. I have told her I am open to rebuilding something, slowly, on the same terms Tommy has already modeled for both of them, terms that require years of consistent, quiet loyalty, rather than a single apology delivered after getting caught. She has, to her credit, kept trying since that letter. Whether it becomes enough, I genuinely do not know yet. Some wounds take longer to close than a single Christmas Eve reckoning, however satisfying, can manage. What I do know, sitting here now in the house Frank built, in the home no court in this state could have taken from me during the 4 years my children convinced themselves and each other that they already had, is this. I spent 4 years being told, in 100 small cruelties and 2 enormous ones, that I was alone. I was never alone. I had a husband who loved me enough to protect me even from beyond his own grave. I had a grandson who called every single Sunday because he wanted to, not because a schedule required it. I had a friend in Rosalind who taught me that grief has a shape you can eventually learn to live inside of, and who told me over a deck of cards that being needed is not the same as being loved, which remains the truest sentence anyone said to me in 4 years. I had an unexpected ally in Nadia, and I had a lawyer in Walter who kept a promise for 6 patient years without ever once asking me to move faster than I was ready to move. If you are watching this and you have ever been told by your own family that you are a burden, a situation, a problem to be quietly managed and discarded, I want you to hear this clearly. Being underestimated is not the same as being powerless. Sometimes the people who love you most are not the ones sitting closest to you at the holiday table. Sometimes they are the ones who show up, quietly, consistently, without ever once needing to be thanked publicly for it, while the people who claim your name loudest are simply waiting for you to become too tired to notice what they're taking. Silence, I learned, over 4 long years, is not the same as surrender. Sometimes it is simply patience, waiting for the exact moment when the truth can no longer be talked around, excused away, or quietly buried under one more cruel little joke tossed off in a doorway on Christmas Eve. I think about Frank often, sitting in this living room he built, in the chair by the window where he used to read the newspaper every Sunday morning before church. I think about the letter he wrote, the trust he insisted on 6 years before either of us knew exactly how much it would matter. The quiet certainty he had that our children, whatever they eventually became, deserved a chance to reveal their true selves on their own timeline, in front of the people whose good opinion actually mattered to them. He was right about all of it. He usually was. These days, my life looks smaller than it once did, and larger than it ever was during those 4 years at Golden Oaks. I have my grandson down the hall. I have Rosalind in the cottage out back, and our nightly card games, and Nadia, who visits on weekends between nursing school classes, bringing news about patients she's helping now the same patient, thorough way she once helped me. I have a company slowly rebuilding itself into something honest again, employing families that depend on it the way families once depended on my husband's word alone. And I have, finally, after 4 years of being told I was still alone, an actual, full life, built not on anyone else's schedule or convenience, but on my own quiet, patient terms. If there is one thing I would ask you to carry away from this story, it is this. Never let anyone convince you that your quiet is the same as your weakness. Never let anyone tell you what you are worth, especially not people who have already decided your worth is inconvenient to their own comfort. And if you ever find yourself waiting, the way I waited, for the right moment to let the truth finally speak for itself, trust that the waiting is not wasted time. It is simply the last quiet mile before everything changes. Have you ever had to sit quietly with a truth, waiting for exactly the right moment to let it finally be known? I would love to hear your story in the comments below, wherever you're watching this from tonight. And if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that being underestimated is never the same as being finished, I hope you'll consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories just like it. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I will see you in the next story.